Traveling in Portugal, I was not prepared for how significant and luscious the botanicals were throughout the city, the countryside, and even architectural sites. When I visit a foreign country, I always notice what are the plants and trees that I've never seen before or how they're different. But I have not seen lemons like I've seen here in Lisbon. A lot of botanical gardens that I visited, they feel like plants on steroids. This botanical garden in Lisbon was no exception. The palm trees were absurdly tall. There were trunks that were just wrapped with botanicals all around them. Oftentimes, before I even start a painting, I like to ask myself, what are some techniques that I want to use to really get the effect that I'm looking for? I knew I really wanted to use atmospheric perspective because if I painted every single aloe leaf to the same degree of darkness and detail, probably the aloe plant would not look very dimensional. I would guess it would end up being very flat. The botanical garden at Lisbon, it's so gigantic. It helped me a lot that I knew I wanted to go straight for the xerophytes. I've always loved how plump and bulbous the forms are in succulents. I knew I was definitely going to find something there that was going to pique my curiosity. I've owned aloe plants in the past. I thought I knew what they looked like. Apparently, I do not, because these aloe plants, they really were trees. There are a bunch of them. They had to have been at least 3 feet taller than me. I've never seen aloe plants that grew to be that tall that had just this cascade of dried gray aloe leaves. It was such a strange combination because the upper part of the aloe plant was very green and very plump. You move downwards, and all of a sudden, the aloe leaves are so spiky. Their forms change because they're dried. They have gestures to them. I'm not that picky about palettes. The most important thing about this palette is that it has a cover so that I can squirt paints out in advance or while I'm painting. I can close the cover and I can still come back to that. This aloe plant that I decided to paint, it felt so majestic to me. It felt like it had really good posture, like a ballet dancer. There was one aloe tree that really was moving across horizontally. Others that were tilted to the left or pushed over to the right. I mean, they really look like figures that are creating gestures. These aloe trees really felt like they were in a group, like I was seeing a family. There were the gigantic, overbearing ones. There were these little baby ones on the side. I'd never really seen aloe in that format before. People are often really surprised that I don't sketch out my watercolor paintings with pencil at the very beginning. I understand the impulse for that because pencil is a material that's really easy to erase. And yeah, you can't erase a stroke of watercolor when you put it down on the paper. But if you keep your brush pretty dry, you really can get a lot of control over the initial drawing, over the initial sketch, if you use very, very thin, light watercolor. I know people worry, oh, well, what if I make a mistake and I'm sketching in with watercolor? Watercolor is all about layering, and I pretty much know if I put down a very, very light sketch in watercolor, there's no chance that's not going to get covered by something else at some point. Sketching in watercolor from the very beginning, I'm thinking in terms of watercolor. My mind is already there. Whereas if I start my sketch with pencil, then I have to transition to watercolor. And I oftentimes think about this initial sketch as a warm up for me to get into the mood to work with the watercolor. When I'm painting on site, it's so important to keep my art supplies super lean. There's always the question with watercolor if you're going to use watercolor cakes or watercolor tubes. I happen to prefer the tubes over the cakes. While I do oftentimes have squirts of watercolor in my palette that do dry out, I do really like the option of squirting out a nice, fresh blob of watercolor paint. And that provides this opportunity for me to interact with the watercolor pigment in a much more fast, significant way. If I'm scrubbing from a dried blob of watercolor paint, it's a lot slower to actually get that full, rich pigment that you can get from squirting out right then and there a big blob of watercolor. In terms of composition, I really wanted to make sure that I included 2 aloe trees. The majestic one was the one I was really after, but I really felt like depth-wise,
it would be a lot better to have one of the aloe trees in front or behind. So I just chose in the lower right-hand corner to depict a couple of the plump leaves from another aloe plant. I wouldn't include all of it, so that way the main emphasis was still on the really tall one. I was thinking in terms of composition to make it look like it was shooting up into the upper left-hand corner, get some of that diagonal action in there. What struck me about this botanical garden was the scale. Walking around the area with cactuses and succulents, I really felt like I had shrunk down to being 2 inches tall. And all of a sudden, I'm standing next to these massive cactuses.
As a painting medium, I feel like watercolor has this superpower. Nowhere but in watercolor are you going to find this freshness that is inherent to the brushstroke, the spontaneity that happens with the flow of the medium. The thing is, the window for capturing and retaining that freshness, it's a really small window. You only have so long to work the piece before it quickly becomes really heavy-handed, overworked, and muddy. I confess that I'm really not that intentional when it comes to color mixing with watercolor. I tend to have tons and tons of colors, which is funny because with oil painting, I try to really limit the number of colors I have. In watercolor, it gives me a little more flexibility, especially when I'm painting on site. I don't like to spend a lot of time really getting involved with mixing specific colors. Most of the time, when I pick up a color off my palette, I have no idea what that color looks like until it actually gets on the page. It really is not precise and is largely an approximation most of the time.
I know people get very intimidated when there's just so much to paint, and this definitely was the case. I mean, there were just so many little pieces of dried aloe. I was definitely not going to paint them all. I paint the ones that really jump out to me. I articulate those, and then whatever's left over, I'll fill in with different textures or spots. Like there are actually a couple aloe plants in this painting that didn't really have those blotchy spots of texture, but I added them anyway because I felt like they were going to give some of those areas a little bit more depth. There's a lot of pieces of dried aloe I just didn't paint. There were a lot of parts that I saw in one area, but I added them somewhere else. The painting process, even in plein air, it's really not that straightforward. There's quite a bit of mixing around. Part of it is I just don't like painting every single leaf, and that would get boring for me really fast. It lets me construct my impression of that aloe plant. And for me, it really was the regal quality of this huge aloe plant.
For watercolor paper, you can get cold press paper, which is very rough on the surface, or you can get hot press paper, which is very smooth. My personal preference is cold pressed paper because I just love the texture and feeling my brush move across that textured surface just feels amazing. But that's not necessarily the case for everybody. I know other artists who only paint with hot pressed paper, and that works great for them. I only use 2 brushes. I use a water brush, super convenient because it has a little compartment in the back where you can fill it with water. I don't have to actually carry a cup of water with me. All I do is I squeeze the back of the water brush, and that then pushes the water into the bristles of the brush. The thing is, a lot of the water brushes, they don't come in very big sizes, so I always have a sumi brush when I really want to throw down a really big, juicy blob of paint. Sumi brushes tend to be a lot tougher to control than, say, a traditional watercolor brush. They're really big and plump. The bristles are extremely fine, and they go all over the place. They're tougher to control. But I like that. I like that spontaneity because it forces me to run with the marks my brush is making as opposed to trying to control every single step of the way. People oftentimes think about watercolor as an additive paint medium, adding brushstrokes to make your piece better. But I think there is so much to be gained by working reductively from the watercolor.
Really can remove a lot from a watercolor. I usually use this blue scrubby sponge. It's got a scrubby side and a soft side. Then I'll follow up by dabbing up some of the damp areas with a paper towel.
To be able to do this, though, you really do need to have very sturdy watercolor paper that can take that reductive quality of scrubbing and removing with a sponge or a paper towel. Make sure you're using fairly thick watercolor paper that's good quality. I'll skimp on tons of art supplies, but watercolor paper, that is not an art supply that I ever skimp on if I can help it, because it really does make or break your experience painting with watercolor. What I'm most conscious about when it comes to my brushwork in watercolor is how wet or dry my brush is. I know people think about watercolor as this beautiful flowing material, and yes, it can be like that, but I'm a control freak and I don't like to paint that way, because basically the more water that is flowing through the brush, the less control you have. And so the vast majority of the time, my brush is actually pretty dry. And if I want to get some really textured stroke, I'll make it super dry on purpose. In terms of a color scheme for this painting, I felt a little bad that I wasn't really taking advantage of the more vibrant colors that were present in other parts of the botanical garden. This painting I'm doing of the aloe, it's not really about color. It's largely a monochromatic piece. The only real shift of color is there was this one piece of aloe that had this yellow streak and a slight reddish tint. That's the one area where I really did think more deliberately about color and getting that area to be more highlighted. But everything else really was a very simple variation on browns and greens. And I did rely pretty heavily on a very dark purple mixture as a substitute for using straight black paint. Straight black paint, to me, oftentimes it feels very dull. And what I like about purple is that you retain the value of black, but it does have a little spice to it that is really nice to have.
I really felt like the spikes that are on the aloe, they really feel like rows of teeth. I wanted to play more with which spikes I wanted to pull forward in the space, which ones I wanted to disappear entirely.
One of the things about painting on site that I think can be very frustrating, but also somewhat a relief, is that I oftentimes don't get to choose when I stop working on the painting. In this case, I was sitting on this little stool and my butt hurt pretty bad after painting at the botanical garden for 3 hours. And that was pretty much the deciding factor about when I was going to get up and leave.
What a lot of people don't realize is that it's okay to go back to your hotel after you've done the painting and work on it some more. And I made a lot of adjustments. Mostly I was removing watercolor from the painting, really trying to get rid of some of those darks that I put in way too fast, way too soon. I also like working on the painting off-site because I can think more thoughtfully about what I want to emphasize.